Hello, everyone, and welcome back from Christmas break. I hope you had a restful, relaxing, recharging um, break, and hopefully 2021 looks a little bit better than 2020, as everyone is saying. But more importantly, it's good to be back, right? We can't finish if we don't ever get started. So, anyways, let's just do that. So, if there was ever a unit to come back to after a break when you're kind of like, oh, honestly, it's this one. The Renaissance and the Reformation, which is what Unit 6 is about, are very heavy hitting events in history that create like pretty massive ripple effects. Prime example, yesterday when we did this lesson, I know I'm a day late in posting this for those of you online, and I'm sorry about that. But yesterday when we did this, I asked a room full of 15, 16-year-old kids living in Gatesville, Texas, if they had ever heard of Leonardo da Vinci. And of course, everybody raised their hand. For an Italian guy that lived close to 600 years ago, that's a pretty incredible legacy to leave behind. So, it's the Renaissance itself changed the way really kind of European culture operated. It was kind of this movement away from being culturally in the dark, of the dark ages and things like that. But it's also a term that has been placed on this era of history by historians. Most people living at the time of the Renaissance, so between 1300 and 1600, didn't know who Leonardo da Vinci was, or who Michelangelo or Donatello or Raphael. And yes, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are named after the high Renaissance masters. But they had no clue who these people were, what they were doing. They were just normal people going about their everyday lives. And very much like honestly, like even me. And it's because art is a rich man's game. It always has been. And so the only way that you knew who like Leonardo da Vinci was, or that Michelangelo had painted the Sistine Chapel for the Roman Catholic Church, the only way that you knew about these types of things is if you were in that part of society, the highly wealthy, the nobility, the aristocracy. And the average person living in that time frame didn't know. And again, like the Renaissance is a title placed on that era by historians. And the analogy I made yesterday is kind of like the reason why authors put chapters in books is because if you opened up a book and it was just words for as far as the eye could see, and you're staring down 400 page of just words that never, ever, ever stop, it's going to be pretty daunting to look at that and think like, oh God, I don't know if I want to read this book. Historians have done the same thing. If you just stared down the entire timeline of history and all of its stories without there being kind of like, well-defined sections, aka chapters, it would be too much to handle. And so that's why historians again have titled, events like the Renaissance. Another thing is we have 18,000 Baptist churches in Gatesville, Texas, because of the Protestant Reformation. Another hugely important ripple affecting event in world history. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, which it's what we're going to be talking about towards the end of this week and next week, you had two choices if you were a Christian. You had two churches you could choose from. You could either be Roman Catholic or you could be Eastern Orthodox. That's it. There was nothing else. There was nothing else that you could choose from. And then the Protestant Reformation happened, and all of a sudden, boom, you have Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Pentecostals, Church of Christ, non-denominational, cowboy churches. I mean, like, take your pick now. There are over 44,000 denominations of Protestantism. So, again, huge ripple effects that you can see driving down Main Street, just even here in Gatesville, Texas. So, again, these two particular events in world history make a very, very lasting impact. And so this is a heavy hitting unit. And it also has a very interesting character in it from world history that's always fun to teach and fun to learn about. And that's King Henry VIII of England. And he's, of course, very famous for having 6 wives and all of that. So we'll be talking about him next week, too. But with that little intro all being stated, let's kind of move forward into the Renaissance. So what does the term Renaissance mean? That was your bell ringer for yesterday. And just kind of an FYI, those of you watching, I'm most of you all did this, but you have to have your bell ringers done, of course, by 1:30 every day now for attendance purposes. But the term Renaissance means rebirth. Again, that was your bell ringer yesterday. And again, this is a term very much thought up by historians because it was a rebirth of culture and art and progression within European society, and they kind of propelled themselves out of the Dark Ages. So, that's kind of where that term came from. And guys, between the 1300s and the 1600s, there's so much that happens. Not only is it the Renaissance, and so you have, of course, your Renaissance masters, but you have some of the most influential monarchs, kings or queens, that come into play during this time frame. Elizabeth I is crowned in England. You have the very famous showdown between England and Spain that happens, in the 60s, 70s, somewhere around in there. Columbus will sail the ocean blue in 1492. So that sparks the new age of exploration. Where North America and South America start to become colonized by these great European powers like Spain and Portugal and England and France, that spark whole new wars that are to come over all of that land. And so, this, again, huge ripple effects from this particular era. That we're going to be kind of talking about for a while in my class, to be honest. We do Renaissance and Reformation, and then we do Age of Exploration, and then we do Age of Absolutism. And it's all of that really is taking place between the 1300s and the 1700s. So, and it's just because it's just so massively important to the trajectory of the rest of history, especially here in the United States. So, where did the Renaissance begin? Well, with names like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, Castiglione, Machiavelli. I mean, they're all Italian. And that's where it began. And so the reason why is because, well, as you know, Italy is a peninsula that juts out into the Mediterranean Sea. So naturally, it has always been a hotbed for lots of trade, lots of port city. Well, people coming and going and going and coming out of that area, you have a pretty vast, diverse, group of people and experiences and exposures, and so the more that you meet people that are from different places and gain their perspectives and see how they live and see differences, well, the more open-minded you get. Mark Twain has a very famous, hang on just a second. He has a very famous Mark Twain travel quote. It's one of my favorite quotes, but I can't remember it. He has a very incredible quote about travel. And yes, it says, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all of one's lifetime. So that's one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain. And he's so right. The more that you get out into the world, the more that you see, the more that your mind opens. And so naturally, because of Italy's, again, location, it has always been more progressive because it's this people are coming and going and coming, as I said. And so, another thing that helps it out, and I know my head is kind of blocking there, but for the most part, it's still a collection of city-states during this time frame. It's not a conglomerated, centralized power under the control of one monarchy, like we saw at the end of Unit 5 with France and Spain and England and the Holy Roman Empire. They all came under the control of one centralized absolute monarch. That's not taking place in Italy. Italy actually won't unify until 1848. So technically the United States is a older nation than Italy. So anyways, so because of that, you don't have an entire area being controlled by the perspective of just one man. And that helps too with progression and open-mindedness. The very first sentence there on this slide pretty much sums up what I just said. Due to their economic power, due to trade and diverse trade, the ideas of the Renaissance developed in Italy. And then, of course, yes, it is going to spread along trade routes to the rest of Europe. And people are going to start, that have money are going to start catching wind of all of this amazing new stuff coming out of Italy. And they're going to hop on the bandwagon. Another thing that really helps Italy be where it begins is that the Byzantine Empire is going to fall in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. Well, there are a ton of scholars that, of course, had originally fled centuries ago when Western Rome, fell in 476. We've talked about this. Of course, they fled to Constantinople, or they had just moved there already before the fall because they saw, the wheels were about to fall off. Well, once they finally fall again to the Turks, those people come back to Rome because, of course, Rome as a city has been completely revitalized and is a really rich and wealthy place because of the Roman Catholic Church. So they come back, and that just fuels more development and progression during the Renaissance. So another thing we talked about yesterday was the Book of the Courtier by Castiglione. And a lot of historians look back on this as kind of like a guideline to the norms and expectations of like your lords and ladies or your courtiers at a king or queen's court. The reality of the Book of the Courtier, however, is that it's a very like idealized viewpoint. Okay, you can aspire to Castiglione's principles, but most people are going to fall short of those marks just because it's all about like consistently having, virtue. Like with a quote, I don't have my textbook right here in front of me, but the quote is basically saying that a courtier would be willing to even tell his king that he was wrong in a decision if it meant that the courtier was trying to do the right thing and keep his king virtuous. I don't know many kings that would probably take to a courtier coming up to him and being like, hey man, not a good call, not a good move. I mean, unless you're like really, really good friends with the king and you feel like he's a good enough guy and a not non-egotistical enough guy to like handle that. But that's kind of few and far between when it comes to absolute monarchs in Europe during this time frame. They all think they're God. So, you definitely can't challenge them. But, so again, it's this kind of like, it's almost like reading a self-help book, right? Like it's try to be the best version of you. Or, when you make New Year's resolutions, like, oh, I'm going to lose 20 pounds by spring break, or I'm going to whatever, I don't know. I don't ever make New Year's resolutions, but, you're trying to do the best that you can in a certain goal, but most of the time you typically kind of fall short of that. And so that's that, but all the nobles of this time frame loved Castiglione and read his book. And honestly, what makes Castiglione particularly interesting to Southerners, which of course us Texans are Southerners, is that antebellum South. So this is the time of slavery and plantations prior to the Civil War. Antebellum South operated very similarly to like European nobility. All right. It was, you had these large areas of land controlled by one person. They had these, big plantation homes. They had balls and, they had big dresses. And I mean, it was a big deal. And everybody, they held court in a sense in antebellum South. At these plantations and these plantation homes and all of that, and the grand parties that they would have. And Castiglione and his book were actually used a lot by antebellum Southerners in how they would present themselves and how they would act. And a lot of that, like, Southern charm kind of comes from this idealized, very like, I'm going to put my best foot forward and be charming and appear to be virtuous at all times type of thing. And so Castiglione, even hundreds of years later in the New World and in the United States, makes a splash as well. As far as peasants and townspeople, that's essentially just talking about the pyramid. The social pyramid is the same, and during the Renaissance, and most people are still peasants and still living in pretty hardcore poverty. Yes, you have a middle class, but it's still very small. I don't want y'all to think that there's some booming great middle class during this time frame. There's not. You still have a large majority of people who are poor peasants, and you have a very small minority of people who are highly, highly wealthy. They're the nobility and the aristocracy. Okay. So that hasn't changed. And of course, the middle class, as we talked about in Unit 5, just as a refresher, are known as the bourgeoisie or the burghers. You can use them, either one. The bourgeoisie, of course, is the French word. Burghers is really kind of much more of like again, like the English version of what they would call the middle class. This is also not that exciting. I mean, but it's going to be the same pretty much in every single unit. Of course, family is going to be a source of great security within a culture. To this day, family is a big deal. And for those of you that have not so great home lives, like, I know that you're sitting there going, well, it's not for me. And I hate that. Like, I hate to hear that from students. But culturally as a whole, okay, family is usually a pretty massive source of comfort and security when the going gets tough. That's kind of who you go to. And so that doesn't really change throughout all of human history. Being patriarchal, that means it's male dominated. That's not going to change. Some could argue even up all the way in just to the past generation. Even within our own society, even though that we are democratic, it was still a very like male dominated society up until just recently. Some could argue that it's even still male dominated. Mothers and wives, that their role was very traditional. Raise the kids, take care of the house, and children, you're seen and not heard until it's time for you to be heard, and then we'll bring you in. But it's very, very traditional lines of families and sex roles. So today in class, we are actually doing an activity. It's not a graded activity. It's more of just kind of an interesting debate on Machiavelli. And I will post the PowerPoint that we're using to kind of stem the debate off of. And I challenge you guys at home to just look through it and see kind of the answers that you would choose, and maybe kind of just let your mind think a little bit about the questions that I pose. But Machiavelli is a very, very brilliant, actually considered really the first political scientist. And he writes The Prince in the 16th century, and he's talking about the kings, the absolute monarchs, the very like power hungry kings of Europe at that time frame. And so it's a very kind of like dog eat dog, survival of the fittest, looking out for number one perspective. And so that sounds kind of like, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. But actually, my sophomore year at A&M, I was actually a political science major there. I had a professor that assigned us this book, and we had to basically find a modern day US comparison to like what Machiavelli is saying. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be the hardest assignment I've ever been assigned in my life. And it actually ended up being really easy, because the thing is, human nature and like trying to grab power and get it and then keep it and then wield it and hang on to it, that doesn't necessarily change. And it doesn't matter what arena you're in, whether it be you are a king within a monarchy, or you are, a senator, or you are a mayor, a governor, a general in the army. A lot of times, like, there are certain situations that you find yourself in as a leader in power where Machiavelli does come into play. And so the central thesis, again, yes, is all about getting and keeping power. But then he's saying that, there's so much that a leader does that isn't black and white. He's saying that once you get into that realm of decision making and you have that kind of power, you're living in a very large state of gray. And so there are times that in order to make the correct decision for your state and for your people, even though in your mind, in your own personal belief and morals, it seems like it's wrong, it's actually the right thing to do. So, again, that final sentence there on the slide, according to him, for the state's sake, a leader must do good when possible, but be ready to do evil when necessary. And so one of the examples that I used yesterday, because most of you have seen this movie, is the Disney animated movie Zootopia. So if most of you have probably seen it, and there are 14 missing mammals, and the reason why they're all missing is, of course, they've been hit with this serum that makes them go savage and like attack the prey, and they're all predators that are being targeted. Well, the little bunny cop and her sidekick finds them and realizes that the mayor is the one that has actually like locked them all up. Well, of course, he has locked them all up because he doesn't no one knows why all of a sudden they've gone savage, and he's trying to figure out why this is happening, and he's trying to protect the people. But, at the end of the day, he locks them up against their will, doesn't tell their families. And even in the movie, he specifically says, when he's being like asked, why did you do this? He's like, it was a classic doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. I mean, like, that's exactly his quote in the movie. That's a very Machiavellian moment. Another very Machiavellian moment that is hotly debated even still to this day is when we dropped the nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima to end World War II. It was a very Machiavellian moment. It was an evil act, but it was to preserve the lives, the hundreds of thousands of lives projected to be lost of our soldiers, and so it's all about, again, looking at politics and understanding that a lot of times your leaders, no matter, again, what their title is, are dealing with way more complex issues than we really understand, and things aren't as black and white as they seem. And that, sometimes a leader, again, has to do evil, for the own good of the state. But he also talks very much about, men in power during that time frame, especially absolute monarchs and kings that were just like, if you don't agree with me, off with your head, and I can easily like just do whatever I want and get away with it. And if that means I have to like kill you and your entire family, then fine. So you kind of have to take, some of the things that he says, and you have to go, ooh, okay, that's a little rough. But if you read between the lines, there's a lot of human nature there that he expands upon that really hasn't changed when it comes to power dynamics and politics. So, anyways, he's a kind of a cool person to read about and read into. So, that is it. We will get into this is a video about just Machiavelli that we watched as well, and we will get into more of like the art and stuff of the Renaissance tomorrow. So I will see you guys then. And again, hope you've had a great break. Bye.